I would like you to raise your hand if you have ever been scrolling on social media, shopping for clothing online, watching TV, or even come across an advertisement where whatever you're seeing is making you feel bad about your appearance or your size and weight. Yeah, so a lot of us. Have you ever found yourself thinking that your own body and weight is problematic and something that you need to change in order to look like the ideal body type that you see in the media? Now imagine that dissatisfaction with your body becomes hatred and you would do anything to change it so that you look more like what is considered beautiful in the media. My thesis question is, how does the implication of eating disorders through media impact the development of eating disorders and the recovery process? And how can this glorified lens be challenged in our society? Eating disorders are recognized as some of the deadliest mental illnesses and naturally have devastating impacts on one's mental, physical, and emotional health. Anorexia specifically has the highest death rate above all other mental disorders. The majority of these deaths are from suicide, giving an indication as to just how devastating the illness is for emotional and mental well-being, as well as physical health. According to the National Association of Anorexia Nervosa and Associated Disorders, patients with anorexia have a risk 18 times higher for suicide than those without an eating disorder. A study conducted by the same source revealed that up to 10% of people with anorexia will die within 10 years of diagnosis, and up to 20% of people with anorexia will die within 20 years of diagnosis. It's also noted that only 30 to 40% of anorexics will ever fully recover. Within the last decade and likely longer, there has been a global increase in the number of eating disorders. Alexandra Dane emphasizes the prevalence in stating that eating disorders continue to be on the rise as diagnoses have risen nearly 50% since the 1970s. During the beginning of my project timeline, I approached my research by looking at the correlation between eating disorders and social and traditional media. I was able to find plentiful evidence which points to the conclusion that there is in fact a strong correlation between the two. I found that social media is one of the more influential developmental factors as well as a prominent maintenance factor. It's quite interesting that eating disorder development seems to have increased within the same time frame as the increase of media usage and exposure. I had to take into consideration that this very well may be a coincidence, but as I continued gathering information, it became apparent that the media does play a significant role in the general increase of eating disorders. As present-day eating disorder numbers have peaked, social media exposure has peaked within a parallel time frame. The University of Maine found that there are currently 4.8 billion social media users worldwide, representing 59.9% of the global population. I also came across multiple statistics and studies which showed that eating disorders are most prevalent amongst younger generations, individuals between 13 and 20 years of age. My sources also happen to show that this is the same generation that is most susceptible and most likely to use social and traditional media. As influential media exposure and eating disorder development has increased, there's also been a shift in the body standard narratives communicated through media geared towards more unrealistic and problematic expectations regarding size and weight. Having an ideal message and portrayal of what one's body weight and size should be erases individuality from a population and restricts everyone to just one body expectation of how they should appear. It's no wonder that one might develop unhealthy eating behaviors or coping skills in order to conform to these standards. A study discussed in Alexandra Dane's research paper found that young women learn from magazines, advertising, fitness clubs, and other cultural institutions that the preferred ideal weight is significantly less than what the medical literature would suggest is healthy. Portraying underweight individuals as the preferred body type communicates the idea that we all need to attempt to make ourselves fit these standards. This is especially evident within the fashion and modeling industries. Nicolette Bogar discusses a study on eating disorders in modeling industries and states that the study corroborates the effect of the model profession on the increase of risk for eating disorders. By portraying these models as icons on the runway, these fashion establishments are essentially justifying and even praising eating disorders. By presenting thin ideals, they are encouraging eating disorders on those who show interest and pay attention to such fashion industries. Now, the media's impacts aren't always surface level. They can have more of an underlying influence on eating disorders. And what I mean by this is that an eating disorder isn't necessarily influenced or triggered by a direct encounter with the media. Instead, the media is used as a way to communicate toxic messages around food and beauty standards, which in turn influences the general public and creates a social narrative, enforcing diet culture and a thin ideal. While I was able to find plentiful data and studies to address my thesis question through my research, I have also learned so much about media's impact on eating disorders from a treatment center, where I was able to hear the experiences of others with eating disorders. Something that all these patients had in common was that the development of their own eating disorders were greatly influenced by social and traditional media content. I was able to hear personal recollections about how these patients were seeing thin people in media and using this as a motivation to engage in eating disorder behaviors in efforts to change their own body. While this isn't necessarily a source that can be credited directly in the same way as data collection or a research paper, being able to witness firsthand accounts of how media impacts eating disorders was extremely helpful for me to establish a better understanding and answer to my thesis question. So I've established that yes, there is a correlation between eating disorders and media usage, but another important question is, why should we care? My hope is that through my action project, I can convey a better understanding of the devastating experiences of an eating disorder. One of the most common circumstances for triggers is unawareness and lack of education regarding just how devastating the experience is. It is only when we can comprehend the experience of an eating disorder that we can have the initiative to prevent triggers and increase sensitivity. So how can we challenge these narratives and go about reducing eating disorders and triggers in everyday life? While we can't always control what regulations are put on media content, we can become more aware and change our own beliefs and views on diet culture and beauty standards. Some of the most common conversation topics that can be easily avoided include negative food judgments, specific numbers regarding weight and measurements, amounts of food, or judgments around certain body types. To change these narratives, it's important to understand why each of these topics are triggering. Food judgments refer to a person's negative reaction to food or an amount of food in the context of it being a good or bad food. This can be triggering to someone with an eating disorder because the eating disorder mindset is constantly hyper-focusing on any little remark or judgment around food that could be used as a way to make that person afraid of the food or want to avoid it themselves. When someone may already be experiencing overwhelming fear and guilt around food, they almost always will keep those feelings to themselves because they may want to hide their eating disorder out of fear of exposure and being vulnerable. This is especially the case in social settings, so by withholding any negative food judgments, we can avoid establishing and building on these narratives that have already been communicated so strongly through media and diet culture. Angus Shen mentions in an article for NPR that Americans cycle through one brand name diet after another, each promising a sure method to lose weight. Along the way, Jenny Craig, Weight Watchers, and Lean Cuisine made fortunes off of their low-calorie, low-fat diet programs and products. These attempts at profiting off of diet culture and an individual's relationship with food and nutrition can be extremely triggering for an individual with an eating disorder, creating more fear foods and reasons to avoid, and it could even be a maintenance factor. The truth is, we need a large variety of foods to function optimally, and there is no food that is more unhealthy than an eating disorder. Eating disorders thrive off of comparison and by constantly judging body sizes and characteristics while looking at everyone else around them on social media. Talking about specific measurements or weight or even food portioning is something that the eating disorder will take and run with, using it as a competitive basis and motivation for engaging more in eating disorder behaviors. Body judgments can also be a huge trigger for eating disorders, as most individuals that struggle also have a distorted perception of their own body image. Body dysmorphia is one of the most common eating disorder characteristics, so naturally one might see themselves as fat or obese no matter the reality of their size. When they hear judgments of overweight people, it increases their fear of being fat, which translates to a fear of gaining any weight at all. Fear of gaining weight is usually the surface reasoning behind eating disorder behaviors. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, back to my thesis question, what does this have to do with social and traditional media? When it comes to media, it's difficult to pinpoint specific instances and examples of triggers because it develops a more under-the-surface message around body image and diet culture by integrating messages and normalizing it. So with discrete integration, media is a great way to establish and enforce eating disorder ideas that the diet industry and fashion industries profit off of. The comments about dieting and body image that we hear from people in everyday life is a result from their exposure to diet culture and disordered eating idealizations communicated through social and traditional media. Stice and Shaw recognize that within social cultural models of distorted eating problems, there are multiple mechanisms which a culturally thin ideal is communicated to individuals, particularly young women. By increasing awareness of these disordered eating narratives, my hope is that media triggers and messages can be reduced and monitored, and the development of eating disorders can see a decrease within communities. On an individual level, we can remember to be aware of conversations and triggers such as weight measurements, food judgments, and body judgments. Chances are, you may know someone who is struggling with an eating disorder or disordered eating, and they might be hesitant to be open about their experience. Being mindful of these triggers can create a safe environment for them and an easier chance at their recovery.